Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time?
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense.
We are the most powerful nation in the world, in the history of the world, for God's sakes, says President Joe Biden. For God's sakes. You know, it's interesting because God has some other things to say. In fact, in Proverbs 16, I believe 16:18, pride comes before destruction, and an arrogant spirit before a fall. You know what? Even if you're an atheist and don't believe anything in the Bible, it's self-evident that that is true. And we've seen it happen so many times in history. And unfortunately, more than just that one comment by the president of the United States, many other senior leaders of our country are given more and more evident that our arrogant spirit is setting us up for some real potential trouble, both in the near term and in the long term. Now, specifically, we're going to talk today about what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war and how the United States senior leaders have been making a lot of very boisterous and big claims about things that we are either going to do or things that we have done. And evidence on the ground suggests that some of these claims are a little bit amiss. We're going to start with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who a couple of days ago laid out four things. No, I'm sorry. We're going to start with actually the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who a couple of months back laid out four things that he wants the United States to do for Ukraine.
To put Ukraine on a solid foundation for the next year, we must help Ukraine do four things at once. First, keep fighting to win back its territory. Second, build a world-class military force to ensure maximum deterrence for the long term and make clear to President Putin that he cannot and will not outlast Ukraine, and he cannot and will not outlast all of Ukraine's supporters. Third, kickstart economic recovery and growth and bring more hope, more opportunity to the Ukrainian people. And fourth, accelerate the reform process to speed Ukraine's path to the European Union and to attract investment.
Okay, what he's talking about there is hundreds of billions of dollars over probably decades of time. And that's just in the financial aspect of it. But some of the specific things that he said there about like economic recovery and accelerating reform, that's code word for getting rid of corruption, which has been plaguing Ukraine for decades. They have long been, even before this war, they were knocked out and identified as the most corrupt regime in Europe. And it's, of course, with all this money and the no accountability that's been flooding into the country since February of 2022, that has unquestionably gotten worse. I don't know if you recall, but a few months back, Ukraine actually, under pressure from the West, fired their defense minister and five senior officials for corruption and for the other kinds of crimes. So they were let go. So obviously, this is a much bigger problem. And yet, here is the Secretary of State saying what we must do for Ukraine, the things that we have to do for them. And now I'm saying, look, number one, we don't have to do anything of the sort. And those things you're talking about, that's not even like just giving them some money or giving them some weapons and ammunition to try to help win a war. You're talking about fundamentally rewiring their entire form of government and then subsidizing it or outright paying it for decades into the future. Did we not learn anything from the debacle of Afghanistan? Does any of this sound familiar? These are things we tried to do for 2 full decades in Afghanistan with their government, with the same kind of issue where we were flooding the place with cash, no oversight, no one ever held it responsible or accountable for the failures. And yet we're trying to do the same thing again. Why would we want to set up the United States for these goals and objectives that are completely divorced from reality that we just got through proving in another country is an objective beyond our capacity to accomplish? Why would we want to do that? Unfortunately, doesn't stop there. Next, we move to the Secretary of Defense, who also had his own little list of 4 things that the United States needs to do in that war.
Ukraine matters profoundly to America, and it matters for 4 key reasons. First, Putin's war poses a stark and direct threat to security in Europe and beyond. Second, Putin's aggression is a clear challenge to our NATO allies. Third, the Kremlin's deliberate cruelty is an attack on our shared values of democracy and decency. And finally, Putin's war is a frontal assault on the international rules-based order.
Okay. Again, 4 things America must do. No, we don't. Again, it's important to reiterate this. We don't have to do anything, but he is, I think, trying to lay out a case there why the U.S. has to keep staying engaged. And he's trying to build this big case of all these grandiose claims that why we have to stay there, so that people listening to this go, oh yeah, I know the war's not going very good. It's been dragging on for almost 2 years now, but wow, I mean, the Secretary of State's right. All these big things are true, but are they? Are they true? Well, let's look at those 4 things, because the first one he said is a stark and direct threat to Europe. Putin is. No, he's not. Now, you don't have to be an expert. You don't even have to believe my analysis, though I think it's got a pretty good track record of having been shown right. But if you know nothing about military affairs and you just look at a map and you just look at a calendar, you see that Vladimir Putin has engaged his entire country, his economic capability, his military industrial capacity, and his entire armed forces to try and subjugate his next door neighbor, one country that has virtually no navy, no air force, or very limited air force, and no treaty allies like NATO, for example. They got no one. In all of this time, he has gotten about 17% of the border area around his country, and he has been unable to go beyond that for well over a year now. And they've been trying to go on offense for now, even several more months, and they still can barely scratch out anything else. By what possible rationale and logic could anyone say that, yes, boy, he poses a direct threat to Europe and to NATO, and my God, we have to continue going on here, otherwise we'll be next? He can't even take the one country. How can you, with a straight face, look at the American people and try to convince them that a 32-member military alliance of the richest countries on the planet, with the most modern equipment and technology of warfare and well-trained troops, that suddenly Russia, who can't take more than 17% of one country, is suddenly going to roll across all of Europe? I mean, what is it? They're going to like go to Paris or something like that? I mean, it's absurd at face value. Now, I don't know why no one ever calls these things out, but it's self-evident that Putin does not pose any kind of a conventional threat to the West, anything beyond Ukraine. He's barely even within that one country. Now, of course, the one threat that they do pose is a nuclear capability threat. They genuinely do have the ability to wipe out the United States and Europe, and of course, have this mutually assured destruction of basically most of the globe. That's a possibility. That's what we should be paying attention to, and that is not going to be solved by continuing to support this one country in their conventional fight for as long as it takes. We're going to get to that in just a second. Unfortunately, Secretary Austin was not finished, because he also added this.
Putin believes that he can outlast the Ukrainians, but he is wrong. The Kremlin is waging an unjust war of imperial aggression, but Ukraine is fighting a defensive war for national survival. And you can feel that urgency on the ground. And that gives Ukraine a huge strategic advantage of a just cause.
A huge strategic advantage because they have a just cause. Now, at face value, certainly some of those things he said are true. And like so many times when people are intending to deceive you, they'll put enough truth in there that gives some credibility to what they're saying. But let's also look at the bottom of this. He is saying that it is important to continue to support Ukraine because they have the strategic advantage. They're fighting for home field advantage, of course. And that's true. They certainly are. They were invaded. Vladimir Putin broke every kind of traditional norm and law of warfare in invading another country. Point blank, black and white, no caveats. He is in the wrong. Ukraine was in the right, and then they have every right to defend themselves and to fight for it. However, It's not a strategic advantage that's going to help you win a war because your cause in your eyes is just. Now, I can certainly point out there that it's also important to understand that the Russians have a point of view, that Putin has a point of view, and to them and their people and their military, their viewpoint is also right. Ergo, they are also fighting furiously for this because they believe this is the entire Western world and NATO all allied against Russia, and they're fighting, in their view, an existential fight. So they are also fighting tooth and nail. You can disagree with it all day long, but it doesn't matter what we think. It matters what the Russians think. It doesn't matter what we think about Ukraine. It matters what Ukraine thinks about Ukraine. And each of those sides is utterly convinced that it's a war of existential significance. So they're both fighting in the same direction, meaning there is no specific strategic advantage to Ukraine because they believe that they're fighting an existential battle. They are, for the most part. That part is actually true. But folks, let me just tell you, bombs don't give a crap about how righteous your cause is. Missiles and rockets don't care if you're fighting on your home soil or not. Mines, I mean, the minefields, they don't care what nationality you are even. You can step on your own mine sometimes, or if the enemy has enough of them out there, which of course Russia does in many of these areas, they don't care. They're going to blow up and they're going to kill whoever they fall in top of. That's where strategic advantage comes from. That's where the capability on the ground in the battlefield matters. Now, certainly, I'm not suggesting that morale doesn't matter, because it matters a great deal, but it only is enough to tip the balance when the other things, the fundamentals of war, are something close into comparison. And right now, they're nothing close to that. And in fact, if anybody has any doubts about this, the Washington Post has just published yesterday a two-part series that takes a look at the recently completed summer offensive by Ukraine. The first part of that looks at all the planning and things that happened ahead of it, and then the last part looks at what actually happened on the ground. Now, we're going to be doing a show specifically, exclusively devoted to what that thing showed, because it is horrible and it's unbelievable in what it showed. But what the bottom line, the net out of it is that it shows that American officials at some of the highest levels, and we're talking about both diplomatic, political, and militarily, have just made some egregious mistakes and things that should have been self-evident and were to many people. Certainly myself is one of them. I was writing that this offensive had virtually no chance of success, even tactically, but had none strategically. It was not going to turn the tide of the war, and there was no reason to think that it would. In April and May, months and weeks before the thing even started off. So for American officials to actually say, no, they actually had a shot, and it was a 50-50 prospect in some of the assessments. There was never a 50-50 prospect. The very things that I pointed out ahead of time are now being exposed as being the reasons why it didn't work. But folks, here's the thing. I'm not trying to brag on myself and saying I have some kind of keen eye or whatever. It's basic common sense. If you're just looking at the fundamentals for what they are and the reality of the situation, these are the conclusions that you have to draw. Nothing is ever 100%. There's always possibility for things to go one direction or another, because humans are involved and mistakes can be made. And sometimes, an iron will can tip the balance. But again, I got to point out the dynamics and the fundamentals have to be something close to being balanced so that can tip it one side or the other. But when it's like this, when it's this far out of balance, it doesn't matter how much motivation and morale and how righteous your cause, you're not going to be able to overcome bombs, bullets, and airplanes. You're just not going to be able to do that. But Americans don't seem to be willing to acknowledge reality. And unfortunately, even those three that we've shown so far are still not the only ones. We had John Kirby, who's actually saying this.
The United States is committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes to succeed on the battlefield. So if by exit strategy he's talking about an end of the war, I'd offer this. Mr. Putin could end it today if he just pulled his troops out of Ukraine where they don't belong. that probably isn't going to happen. The Ukrainians want this to end immediately, and we all want to see this war end. But it's got to end on terms that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people can accept. We want to help them succeed on the battlefield so that if and when President Zelensky, and only President Zelensky can determine when it's time to sit down with President Putin, that he can sit down and have a diplomatic dialogue with the wind at his back and with some strength.
Okay, that was September 21st. That means that there was 3 full months of the offensive up to that point. And it was already blatantly obvious that it was not going to work. Not only did it not have even marginal tactical success, it had none whatsoever. We've talked on that quite a bit here on Deep Dive. You can see plenty of those episodes in the past, how there's tactically nothing was done. So why do we have this John Kirby, one of the chief spokesmen for the administration, telling everybody that we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We're going to keep giving them stuff. And that Zelensky, and only Zelensky, is going to make the call on how far we go. Folks, why doesn't American national interest enter into the conversation? I mean, even show me a caveat. Let me at least see Kirby or some other senior official or the president say something like, well, we're going to help them as long as it makes sense, but we also have to keep our own resources in mind. We also have to keep our own intelligence at the front. We've got to make sure that we do things that make sense for America, that have a chance to succeed. None of that. We just see we're going to leave it to Zelensky. And look, if you have any doubts about how this is impacting on Zelensky and where they're at now, I want to show you a little bit of a juxtaposition. First, I'm going to show you how confident President Zelensky was when he came before the United States Congress in a joint session in exactly 1 year ago, almost to the day here in December of 2022, after Ukraine had their 2 major successes of taking back a large chunk of the north part in the Kharkiv area, and then having retaken the city of Kherson City in the south. So buoyed by that, watch how confident he is.
Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking. Thank you. And it gives me good reason to share with you our first joint victory. We defeated Russia in the battle for minds of the world. We have no fear, nor should anyone in the world have it. Ukrainians gained this victory, and it gives us courage, which inspires the entire world.
So he's basically saying the same thing that some of the Americans have been saying, that, yeah, boy, they got the strategic advantage, like Austin said, because they're fighting for their home court and they got all this courage and stuff. And man, did they ever, and do they continue still to do so? The Ukrainian side continues to show unbelievable courage and strength of character to continue fighting, even in the face of all these setbacks. But folks, we're not doing anybody any favors by ignoring that reality and saying, hey, we're going to keep going on without making any changes, without even requiring anything to be done differently. Now, you just saw what Zelensky was like a year ago. Let's see what he's like just a week ago.
Всі розуміють, що це найвища ціна. І тому я вас дуже прошу берегти себе, берегти своїх близьких, побратимів, військових, офіцерів, солдатів, звичайних солдатів, які з вами поруч воюють щоденно, віддаючи своє життя заради України. Я бажаю вам перемоги, бути міцними, не втрачати ініціативу, захищати Харківщину, захищати Куп'янськ, захищати кожного.
I mean, you can see in his eye, there's no confidence there at all. There's no really even belief in what he's telling these troopers. And he keeps talking about these casualties. Folks, it's probably well over 200,000, maybe a lot more than that, of people who have been killed in this war. Probably hundreds of thousands more have been wounded. The numbers are very, very high. And if you've suffered that many casualties and yet you haven't gained anything, and I mean nothing in the past 12 months, the front lines have virtually remained unchanged. What has changed, however, is the overall power dynamics. They continue to move in the direction of Russia. Russia now has their defense industry is now cranking on all cylinders, and they're going to continue to put out more artillery shells, more drones, more armored vehicles, repairing armored vehicles, all that within their own control. Meanwhile, on the Western side, you have a dwindling supply. We already gave, the West generally already gave as many modern tanks as they have spare capacity to do so. They've already given, the artillery pieces, the rocket launchers, the artillery shells. We are not producing a fraction of what they need. According to most reports recently, it's about 10% of their need. And they used a huge portion of that already in the summer offensive. There's not that much left. Russia is going in the exact opposite direction. Russia also has expanded its military. They've added somewhere around 400,000 new people this year, not even by forced mobilization, but by recruiting people that well more than offset what they have lost. So they've actually gained in some size, and they have now actually set the stage for potentially doing another mobilization, as they've set a goal of 2 million active troops to get to in 2024. Time is on Russia's side. It's not on Ukraine's side. And even what we have given so far, there's not much left to give. And you see in the U.S. Congress, for example, we've already missed 2 spending bills where we had an opportunity to give more money to Ukraine, which President Biden had asked for, and we didn't take it. And now then we have another opportunity coming in January, and in February. It's unclear whether any of that's going to be, because there's a lot of dispute both within the Republican Party and between the Republican and Democratic parties. And it's moving in the wrong direction. But no matter what they do, I imagine they'll end up doing something, but it's probably not going to be $60 billion. Remember, there was $113 billion last year, which changed nothing on the battlefield. Now then, the best they're going to get is about half of that. And I doubt that they'll even do that. So again, we have to look at the stark reality. Upon what basis can anyone say we should keep waging war for as long as it takes when there are no fundamentals that show that there's any chance of a strategic victory? Some people may say, well, let's just keep doing this and we'll keep it a stalemated war for a long time, and that'll keep hurting Russia. But folks, listen to what I just told you. Russia is improving. They're getting their troops bigger, numbers of troops bigger. They're getting their armament supplies modernized. They're getting more of it, and they're getting combat experience in large-scale combined arms operations, and they're getting better by the month, as we've seen. So the longer this goes, the higher the chance that Russia ends up winning a conventional victory. Ukraine may not be able to hold on to all at once because it's not going to have the artillery shells under any scenario that they want. Russia will, and of course, all the other aspects that go into that as well. Now, Putin is aware of this, and he's not making any interest in having a negotiated settlement because he thinks that either he's going to get a deal on his terms or that he's going to eventually win. And he could go on for another year or two if it took to get that. Ukraine cannot. Folks, it is time. It is past time, but definitely time. If you care about Ukraine, if you care about the people of Ukraine, the cities of Ukraine, the soldiers of Ukraine, if you really care about them, it is time to say we need to have a negotiated settlement. We have got to do something different. Trying to win the war because we think our side is in the righteous side is irrelevant. It doesn't matter in this case because you don't have the fundamentals to make good on that aspiration. And to continue trying is going to condemn more Ukrainian people to death. And probably the most likely case is the loss of more Ukrainian territory as time goes on. So by continuing to say, no, we have the upper hand here, we have the righteous cause, you're actually perversely making the case that Ukraine is most likely going to lose more and suffer more death and still not end up with their territory. We're going to have to do something different. And the time has come to just acknowledge reality, and our leaders need to start dealing straight with us. It's time for the truth. That's all we have for you today. We're going to have some really good shows for you tomorrow. We have Tony Schaefer, always a great guest to have. We're going to have him on live tomorrow, so check back with us for that. In the meantime, we're going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised, bringing you the information you need to make sense out of your world. We'll see you next time on Deep Dive.